Do you think anyone's ever truly honest about what they want? Oliver's voice cut through the crackling of the campfire, his words hanging in the crisp night air like mist. I glanced at him, his face illuminated in flickering orange light. For a moment, I thought he was talking to himself, but his eyes were on me, sharp and searching. I hesitated, unsure how to answer a question that felt too big for the quiet intimacy of the wilderness. I think sometimes it's easier to lie, I finally said, shifting awkwardly on the tree stump. The flames danced between us, their warmth doing little to ease the growing tension I felt. Oliver smiled faintly, the kind of smile that suggested he knew more than he let on. Yeah, I guess so. We had come here for a simple weekend getaway. Just two old friends, escaping the chaos of city life. The forest was a haven of sorts, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But now, sitting across from him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip wasn't going to be simple at all. Oliver and I had been friends for years, ever since high school when he defended me in a locker room scuffle I'd rather forget. He'd always been the kind of person who drew people in effortlessly, charming, confident, and disarmingly kind. Girls fawned over him. Guys wanted to be him. And me? I'd always been his shadow, the quieter counterpart, the one who kept his thoughts to himself. If Oliver was the sun, warm and bright, I was the moon, reflecting his light, but never quite standing on my own. When he'd suggested this camping trip, I jumped at the chance. It had been months since we'd spent any real time together, and I'd missed him more than I was willing to admit. The campsite was nestled deep in the woods, miles from cell service and surrounded by towering pines. We'd spent the day hiking, laughing over old jokes, and sharing beers by the lake. It felt good, comfortable, familiar. But now, under the weight of the night sky, something had shifted. You okay sharing the tent? Oliver asked casually, snapping me out of my thoughts. My heart skipped. Yeah, of course. He grinned, the easy, boyish grin I knew so well. Cool. Didn't feel like lugging mine up the hill. I nodded, trying to match his nonchalance, but my mind was already racing. It wasn't the first time we'd shared close quarters. We'd done road trips, crashed on couches, even shared beds during our college years. But this felt different. The tent wasn't large, just enough space for 2 sleeping bags and our gear. As we set it up earlier, I'd imagined how small it would feel once we were inside, how close we'd be. Too close, maybe. As the fire died down, the conversation drifted to lighter topics: work, childhood memories, his latest fling. He always had stories about women he was dating, and tonight was no exception. But instead of the usual pang of jealousy or longing I tried to bury, I felt something else, a nagging curiosity. "What about you?" he asked, tilting his head. I blinked. "What about me? Anyone in your life right now?" I hesitated, caught off guard. "Not really." He studied me, his expression unreadable. "Why not?" I shrugged. "Just hasn't happened." Oliver leaned back, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "Maybe you're too honest about what you want," he murmured, more to himself than to me. His words stayed with me as we cleaned up the campsite and prepared to settle in for the night. Inside the tent, the air was warm and thick, carrying the faint scent of pine and campfire smoke. Oliver slid into his sleeping bag beside me, his arm brushing mine as he adjusted. The space felt impossibly small, every sound magnified in the silence. "Night, Henry," he said softly, his voice unusually tender. "Night," I replied, my heart pounding in the dark. As I lay there, staring at the faint outline of the tent roof, I couldn't help but wonder what he really meant by his question. Did anyone ever truly know what they wanted? Or was it easier to pretend otherwise? And more importantly, had Oliver been asking about me or about himself? The tent was quieter than I expected, save for the occasional rustle of fabric or the distant call of an owl. Oliver lay just a breath away, his back turned to me at first. The scent of campfire lingered in the air, mingling with the faint, earthy smell of the forest. I tried to focus on my breathing, keeping it steady, but every inhale felt too loud in the cramped space. My thoughts raced as I stared at the faint outline of the tent's fabric ceiling. Did he notice the tension between us? Did I? Or was I just reading into nothing? You awake? Oliver's voice, low and quiet, broke the silence. My heart stuttered. Yeah, I whispered back. He shifted, rolling onto his back. The faint moonlight filtering through the tent caught the angles of his face, softening them. I can never sleep on trips like this. You? Same? Oliver turned his head to look at me. His gaze held something unspoken, something I couldn't quite name. Remember that trip we took to the beach after graduation? I nodded, unsure where he was going with this. We shared that crappy motel room. He continued, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I don't think we slept then either. Spent half the night talking about all the stupid stuff we wanted to do with our lives. I chuckled softly, the memory warming me. You said you'd become a professional surfer, and you said you'd write a book about it. He countered, grinning. The air between us felt lighter for a moment, but then his smile faded, and his expression grew thoughtful. Do you ever think about how things turned out? Like, how different it all is from what we planned? I swallowed hard, sensing the shift. Yes, sometimes. He hesitated, his gaze flickering away before returning. Do you ever wish you'd done something differently? The question hit deeper than I expected. My mind swirled with memories and regrets I couldn't quite articulate. I guess sometimes I wish I'd been braver about certain things. Oliver's eyes searched mine, his expression unreadable. Like what? The words caught in my throat. I couldn't tell him the truth. Not here, not now. Instead, I shrugged, trying to play it off. You know, life stuff. Career. Relationships. He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded as if accepting my half-answer. Yeah, me too. Minutes passed in silence, but the quiet between us didn't feel empty. It felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Oliver shifted again, his arm brushing mine, the contact lingering just a fraction too long to be accidental. My pulse quickened, and I turned my head slightly, trying to gauge his expression. His eyes were half closed, but there was a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. Henry, he said softly, my name barely audible in the stillness. Yeah. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned fully onto his side, facing me now. I was just thinking about what you said earlier, about being honest. I held my breath, unsure of where this was going. It's hard, you know? Being honest, he continued, his voice low and measured, especially when you don't even know what you're feeling half the time. His words hung heavy in the air, and I felt the weight of them pressing against my chest. Yeah, I murmured. I know. For a moment, neither of us moved. The space between us felt impossibly small, and yet the divide seemed vast. Then, almost imperceptibly, Oliver's hand shifted, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was so faint it could have been a mistake, but when I didn't pull away, he didn't either. My heart pounded, the sound deafening in my ears. Oliver! His eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was no ambiguity in his gaze. It was raw, open, and full of questions he wasn't ready to ask out loud. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Me neither, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, caught in the fragile, electric moment where everything felt possible and nothing felt certain. His hand lingered against mine, and I could feel the unspoken words between us, hovering just out of reach. Then he pulled back, his fingers slipping away as he rolled onto his back again. We should probably try to sleep, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Yeah, I replied, my voice hoarse. But sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake, my mind replaying every second of the encounter, wondering what it meant, and whether it had changed everything between us. Morning arrived with the kind of stillness only the forest could provide. The sunlight filtered through the dense canopy above, casting shifting patterns on the tent walls. For a moment, I forgot where I was, until I turned my head and saw Oliver lying beside me, his features relaxed in sleep. The memory of the night before surged back, and my chest tightened. His hand brushing mine, the unspoken words in his eyes. The way he'd pulled back, leaving me stranded in my own confusion. I sat up carefully, not wanting to wake him, and unzipped the tent. The cool morning air greeted me, sharp and grounding. I needed space, even if it was only a few feet. The campsite felt different now, less like a peaceful retreat and more like a stage where something fragile and unspoken had played out. I busied myself rekindling the fire, but my hands trembled as I arranged the kindling. "Hey!" Oliver's voice startled me. I turned to find him standing just outside the tent, his hair disheveled, his face a mix of exhaustion and something I couldn't place. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, his posture hesitant. "Morning," I said, my voice too bright, too forced. He walked over and crouched beside me, his presence almost overwhelming in the quiet. "You're up early?" "Couldn't sleep," I replied, not meeting his eyes. Oliver nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire as it began to crackle to life. "Me neither." The silence between us was heavy, and I felt the weight of the night pressing down on both of us. I wanted to say something, anything, to cut through the tension, but I didn't know where to start. "About last night," Oliver began, his voice low. I froze, my breath catching. "I don't want things to get weird between us," he said, his tone carefully measured. The words stung more than I expected. I forced myself to look at him, searching his face for some clue to what he was feeling. "Weird," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, I don't know what happened, or what I was thinking. It was late, and—" "You don't have to explain," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Oliver flinched, his expression shifting to one of quiet guilt. "I just don't want to mess this up, Henry. You're important to me." Important. The word hung in the air like a stone, heavy and immovable. It wasn't the word I wanted, but it was all he was offering. "I get it," I said, forcing a small smile. "We've been friends for too long to let one weird night ruin everything, right?" Oliver nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Exactly." But as the morning wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The easy camaraderie we'd always shared felt strained now. Every interaction tinged with unspoken questions and half-buried emotions. As we packed up the campsite, Oliver seemed quieter than usual, his laughter muted, his smiles fleeting. I wondered if he was wrestling with the same thoughts I was, or if he'd already pushed it all aside, neatly filed away as a moment of confusion. The hike back to the car was uneventful, the forest around us vibrant and alive in a way that felt almost mocking. I kept my eyes on the trail, my mind replaying every detail of the night before, analyzing every word, every glance, every touch. When we reached the car, Oliver turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for coming out here with me. It was nice." Nice. Another word that felt like a slap. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "It was good to catch up." He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something else, something that might crack through the wall between us. But then he nodded and climbed into the driver's seat, leaving the silence to fill the space he left behind. The drive home was quiet, the miles slipping by in a blur. I stared out the window, the scenery passing unnoticed. I wanted to say something to break the silence, but every word that came to mind felt wrong. When he finally pulled up in front of my apartment, Oliver turned to me, his expression soft but guarded. "We're good, right?" I met his gaze, searching for something, anything that might tell me what he was really thinking. "Yeah, we're good." He nodded, his smile faint but genuine. "Okay, I'll see you around." As I watched him drive away, a hollow ache settled in my chest. We might be good, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind in that tent, something we'd never fully acknowledge. I turned and walked inside, my mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to reach out, to demand answers, to take the risk. But another part knew that whatever had happened between us was too fragile, too uncertain to survive in the light of day. Some things I realized are meant to stay unspoken,